Assalamu alaikum viewers and welcome back to Prime Live. On the eve of the release of a crucial United Nations Human Rights Office report on the actions by Israeli military in Gaza, Prime Minister Netanyahu sent out a statement appealing for more US weapons to, quote, finish the job of the IDF in Gaza. Let's take a look.
Secretary Blinken was recently here in Israel. We had a candid conversation. I said I deeply appreciated the support the U.S. has given Israel from the beginning of the war. But I also said something else. I said it's inconceivable that in the past few months, the administration has been withholding weapons and ammunition to Israel. Israel, America's closest ally, fighting for its life, fighting against Iran and our other common enemies. Secretary Blinken assured me that the administration is working day and night to remove these bottlenecks. I certainly hope that's the case. It should be the case. During World War II, Churchill told the United States, give us the tools, we'll do the job. And I say, give us the tools and we'll finish the job a lot faster.
The report examined 6 incidents since October last year and found that Israel may have violated the laws of war and that it failed to distinguish between civilians and fighters in its war on Gaza. A separate UN inquiry has accused Israel of carrying out a campaign of the extermination of Palestinians. And to date, more than 37,000 Palestinians have been killed since last October. My guest is a rights activist and a research fellow at the Africa-Asia Dialogues, Ayesha Kajee. Assalamu alaikum, Ayesha, and welcome to Prime Live.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you so much for your time this evening. To start off our conversation, firstly, what are your reactions to this report by the United Nations Human Rights Office?
Well, I think the report is actually very, very factual. It is underscored by substantive evidence of the claims that the UNHCR is making. And the really can be no doubt following this that Israel has violated the principles of international humanitarian law, not in one way, but in multiple ways, on multiple occasions, and in multiple areas, both within Gaza and in the occupied territories, the West Bank and East Jerusalem as well.
We heard the statement by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. Do you believe that he has further incriminated himself and also the United States by the messages and the sentiments that he shared in that statement?
Well, certainly he has further incriminated himself. Whether it will extend to the United States support of Israel, both in terms of financial support as well as the provision of military hardware, that remains to be seen. And that, it would have to be, there would have to be a test case in international law, either at the International Court of Justice, where another UN member brings the U.S. To the ICJ as an accessory to war crimes or genocide or whichever, violation of international humanitarian law they wish to test. Or if Mr. Biden or Mr. Blinken or other senior members of the U.S. administration are brought to the International Criminal Court for investigation.
Speaking about the United States, we know that they are one of the number one allies to the State of Israel. And the United States has yet to be included in any legal action when it comes to the ICJ. Do you believe that there is now sufficient grounds to be able to do so, to include the United States and possibly prosecute them at the ICJ?
I think there's certainly sufficient grounds to do so. Not only the United States, although primarily the United States, but not only the United States, but other supporters of Israel in terms of both financial backing and the provision of either military hardware, the weapons of war, or aspects of that hardware that are necessary for example, bombs to be launched, etc. Because the severity of the attack on Gaza over the last almost 9 months certainly shows that those countries ought to be held responsible. Whether, however, there is that appetite for holding them responsible, particularly the appetite to hold the United States responsible, given its long-standing so-called superpower status, as well as its veto abilities within the United Nations, etc., within the Security Council of the United Nations, whether the appetite is there to actually hold the US accountable from other countries is the big question, and whether anybody will have the courage to do so. We saw, that up until South Africa brought the case against Israel at the International Court of Justice in The Hague, we saw that no other countries actually had that appetite to do so. We've seen Israel repeatedly violate the laws of war, violate international humanitarian law, not just in the current assault on Gaza, but in previous assaults, not only on Gaza, but also in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, etc. And up until January this year, with South Africa bringing that case to the ICJ, no other country has had the appetite to do so. I think the appetite to bring the US to account will be even less, given that the US has enormous and wide-ranging trade links and aid links with many countries around the world, including those that purport to be supporters of human rights for all.
Absolutely. They've definitely made themselves one of the big players when it comes to the international community and the international space. Pretty much a very big target and a very difficult target to hit. And we know that historically the United States has had, a piece of the pie in terms of every war that has existed in our history. They've always had some kind of involvement or support in some way or the other. But I want to steer our conversation back to the UN report. One of the findings of the UN report released today is that the IDF may have violated the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precautions in attack. What does this mean in terms of layman's terms? What does this actually mean?
Well, the law or the principle of distinction actually means that you ought to be able, with a reasonable chance of successfully doing so, if you are launching an assault against specific targets, against military targets, against people who are armed or arms installations, etc. You should be able to distinguish between those targets and the bulk of civilians who may or may not be present in that area, whether they live in that area or whether they work in that area, whether they are present there for reasons of commerce or other reasons. There should be sufficient distinction between civilians and military targets. And what the UN has concluded is that the IDF did not make that distinction with sufficiently high probability of successfully identifying only the military targets. They just went in indiscriminately, and as we have seen repeatedly, have had large numbers of civilian wounded as well as large numbers of civilian casualties, civilian deaths. So we've seen that. That's the principle of distinction. The principle of proportionality is whether their attack on Gaza, their alleged attack on Hamas targets in Gaza. Okay, this is what they allege, that they're going after so-called Hamas terrorists. Whether that is in proportion to whatever they are wreaking retribution for. In other words, the events of October 7th, or what Hamas called Al-Aqsa flood. Now, given the massive, large-scale, indiscriminate attacks on various parts of Gaza, with the exceedingly high numbers of civilian casualties, including numbers of women, of children, of elderly, of people who could not possibly, by any stretch of the imagination, be legitimate military targets. That principle of proportionality has certainly been violated. So that is not to say that the events of October 7th did not wound, and indeed kill and take hostage some civilians. But the level of casualties, of wounded, and of hostages on the one side is far less than the level on the other. And I'm trying to be really careful here, Nazia, because we really cannot talk about this as though there's an equal playing field. You know, we cannot talk about two equal sides here. Hamas is equipped with homemade weapons by and large, whereas Israel has one of the most sophisticated military arsenals anywhere in the world, the fifth largest army anywhere in the world, and a very, very high-tech, sophisticated military equipment and arsenal, both in terms of actual weapons of war, but also in terms of surveillance, in terms of intelligence, etc. So there really cannot be any question of proportionality between the two sides. There's no question of a level playing field. Add to that the fact that Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem are recognized under international law as occupied territory. The law governing military operations in occupied territory is even more stringent because the occupying force, in this case Israel, has a responsibility to protect civilian life in the territory that it occupies. And so there again can be no question of proportionality. But just in terms of sheer warfare, even if this were not occupied territory, even if there were two equally or fairly equally equipped armies and military supplies, etc., even if that were the case, the principle of proportionality has certainly been thrown out the window, given the huge numbers, tens of thousands of casualties and hundreds of thousands of wounded and millions of displaced people in Gaza, on the one hand, and then in relative terms, low numbers of civilian casualties, injuries, and hostages on the other.
Absolutely.
There is no proportionality.
Absolutely, without a doubt. I think that's why for me it's even difficult for me to even use the word or the term war when it comes to what is happening in Gaza. We cannot call it a war. It is not two nuclear powers that are coming together and fighting. It's civilians versus the IDF. And like you said, homemade weaponry versus the most, the most high-tech weaponry you can find in the world. And just thinking about and looking at those statistics of the casualties that we have seen in Gaza, most of them are young children, and they have definitely, I think, from the early days of 7th of October, even from the beginning of Israel's genocide in Gaza, it was very clear to see that these violations have occurred from the very, very beginning. But we thank you so much, Ayesha, for joining us this evening, for sharing your insight and really allowing us to be able to understand the report, what it actually means. And although a lot of people might feel this is a bit late in the game for them to be coming out with this information, because as we said from the very early onset, violations of law were very, very clear, as you have shared with us this evening as well. We thank you so much for your time and your expertise on this topic, and thank you for sharing with us this evening.
Shukran jazilan. Just to add, you mentioned children, Nazia. This war, if you want to call it that, which I don't, as you said, it's not a war, it's not a conflict, it's an attack. So this attack, ongoing attack by Israel on Gaza, has actually brought about the largest number of child amputees, some of them multiple amputees. So not just one arm or leg lost, sometimes all four limbs lost in some cases. The largest number of child amputees in any conflict, in any area of the world, at any time in history. That gives you some idea of the lack of distinction and the lack of proportionality of the IDF's behavior in Gaza. So once again, Jazakallah khair for having me on. And really, people should be disseminating this report and discussing it and bringing it up in conversation when you have people defending Israel with what I call, circular arguments. Yes, but. There is no yes, but in this attack, in this sustained, ongoing genocide.
I couldn't agree more. And thank you for starting that very conversation with us this evening. And I know that our conversation tonight regarding this report is going to be a ripple effects of conversations in homes all across South Africa, which is exactly what we want. Thank you so much, Ayesha, for joining us this evening and for your time.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam. Viewers at home, that is Ayesha Kajee. She absolutely assisted us in really nitpicking at this report that was issued by the United Nations. And as we saw in our discussion today, the violations of war, or as we say, the term war, that is used by the United Nations, those violations have existed long ago. And this report is very much very delayed when it comes to the issues that have been being inflicted on Palestine, or I would rather say not a war, the genocide that has been inflicted on the people of Palestine. But do share your thoughts with us on our social media platforms, and do go and educate yourself a bit more about the report. Go and read up on it, and like Ayesha encouraged us all, her call to action was educate yourself, create that awareness, and start conversations and discussions about this very report. Hopefully this report will materialize into something, but as everything with the United Nations, it's a lot of talk and no action. But do engage with us on our social media platforms. Let us know your thoughts and let us know your comments. And remember to always stay tuned to Prime Live so that we can have these important discussions and start these important discussions that need to be happening, not in just political spaces, but in our homes as well. On that note, it is time for us to take an ad break, and we'll come right back.